Hi, Ira Koyner here, the original IRA and president of Triathlon Partners. Thanks for tuning in to episode 3 of our highlights from our wealth building workshop of how to bridge the gap from your financial situation now to where you want to be in with your financial goals. So we're really going to get right into it. And where we left off in the last episode was about this point-to-point strategy, which has protection on the downside as well as has a cap on the top side. We're going to use a specific example, and that example is going to be based on the S&P 500, right? This is going to be called the standard segment, is what it's traditionally called, where the first 10% of a loss of the underlying security, which is the S&P 500, you get refunded your money, right? You only lose money once the S&P 500 is down more than 10% and you're down the difference. So S&P 500 is down 12, you're down 2%, right? And in return, there's a cap, meaning in the year, when the year's over, you cannot earn more than 15%. That's the cap. If the S&P 500 is up 10%, you're up 10%. S&P 500 is up 20, the cap kicked in, you're only up 15. All right. So we could see how this is going to limit the losses and it's going to lower the standard deviation of our portfolio, which is great. So I'm going to show you some slides I have, which hopefully from the graphical standpoint, really help explain this because it is tough to put into words. So here we have S&P 500 with a dividend, compounded return 8.25%, and the standard deviation is 16.4. Standard deviation is basically a measure of volatility. Now, in this standard segment, right, I have run a simulation for a 30-year performance. I've run it 10,000 times, right? And 10,000 times when I run it with the buffer and the cap, right, the S&P 500 standard segment has a compounded return of 6.42% and a standard deviation of 8.77. All right, so we look at this and we're like, hey, standard, and also keep in mind, in the standard segment is a tax-deferred product. The S&P 500 with a dividend, you might not actually have in a tax-deferred product, but you can actually move it to one. So that's something to keep in mind when we're looking at this analysis. So when we look at this, we see that, well, you're only earning about 78% of the S&P 500 with the dividend, but your standard deviation is almost half. All right, so what does that actually mean, right? And what does it look like when we actually have an asset, because that's what we want to compare it to, that has a standard deviation of 8.77, right? Because that's much lower than the equity standard deviations that we have, right? So when we see this, well, there's no equity close to 8.77, right? We do have returns here, 6.42, which are higher than international stocks. But when you look at the amount of return that you're getting for the drop in standard deviation, certainly you're getting a higher return than high yield bonds with a smaller volatility. This is something that what we like at Triathlon Partners, because it actually does diversify your returns because it lowers the volatility, right? Now, how do we actually depict that? Well, how do we depict that is when we look at the volatility, we look at it as a normal distribution, the bell curve. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with that. Now, up top in the purple is the S&P 500 bell curve, where we have the return is the x-axis and the y-axis is how often it happens. And we have the same thing for the standard segment that we spoke about. But when I have the two separate graphs, the axes are different, so you can't really compare them. When I put them on the same axis, you see the green, which is the standard segment, has much higher probability of coming to that mean, that average price, than the purple, which is more spread out. So from that standpoint, this is going to lower your volatility. It's going to give you more certainty on what your return is going to look like, right? And that's really the point of lowering the volatility of your portfolios, right? You're not going to have that probability of losing money going into the last years of retirement, whereas you might, going into last years of retirement, decide, hey, I want to be involved in fixed income because it's less risky. Well, guess what? Fixed income, you're not earning 6.42%. You're earning, if we go back a slide, US bonds, you're earning 2.8%, right? Even the high yield bonds, 4.4%. And look at these volatilities. It doesn't make sense when you look at the risk and the volatility uh, of the standard segment. Now, let's go to another product, very common in insurance, this point-to-point system. And this one has basically some sort of weighted average of three different components: S&P 500, NASDAQ, Dow Jones. We're using the same S&P 500 with dividends versus these indexes without. And for this, we're going to have a floor of 0, meaning you can't lose any money, and a cap of 13%. Now, this is a phenomenal product. We see that the average compounded return, when I've run for this, is the average return over 30 years, and I've run this 10,000 times, right? This floor, with the floor and the cap, the compounded average return is 7.3%, less than 1% off from the S&P with the dividends. But look at the standard deviation, 5.8 versus 16.4. What asset has a 5.8 volatility? Well, international bonds are only yielding you 2.6. But look, you're getting a small U.S. small cap stock return for a volatility that's close to international bonds. This is something you need to pay attention to, because we're going to do it again. Here you go. This is the distribution of the S&P 500. Here's the distribution of the multi-asset with the cap and floor. And look how much tighter it is, that you get closer to that mean, to that average return over the 30 years. And look, you're not subject to this wing risk, but this average return at 7.36 is fantastic. And this product is also in a tax-deferred product, and the money can be withdrawn tax-free, tax-exempt, because it is an insurance product. Okay, now something else. One more quick one is a structured note. You know, I've been talking about these, and here's a structured note term that I really like: 5 years on the Euro Stock 50. Guess what? After 5 years, if the index is down, right, it covers the first 40% loss, right? Means index down 30%, you get 100% of your money back. Index down 50%. Well, the first 40% loss on this one is covered, so you're only down 10, right? You get 90% of your money back. It's good. It's something good anyway, because you could see when we put in those floors what the volatility gets cut by. This has an upside participation ratio of 1.9, which means after 5 years, if the return is positive, multiply it times 1.9, you're even going to get a bigger return. All right. So, and when we look at that, international stocks, 5.2 with a 20.9. What does that floor do? It just crushes this volatility. What does that return do? Multiply it times 1.9. It's going to skyrocket. It's going to be a better performer than U.S. large cap stocks, both in the return and in the volatility will be lower. So these are things that you have to keep your eye on, right? Keep your eye on these. The first one was an annuity. The second one was in a life insurance product, and both tax deferred, and the life insurance is possibly tax exempt withdrawals. And the third one was in a structured note, right? So these are things you got to know about. Resonated really well with our audience at our workshops. So please give us a call if you have any questions. Everyone, Ira Koyner here, the original IRA. Take care and have a blessed day.